Detective Mark Harris could never forget the night his sister Emily died. The image of her body, mutilated, twisted, and forever locked in that grotesque grin, was burned into his mind. His nightmares were filled with blood-soaked walls and the message Jeff the killer had left for him. Go to sleep. Emily had just been one of Jeff's many victims, but for Harris, it was personal. Her death had shaped his entire career, pushing him deeper into a world of violence and death. Jeff had vanished without a trace after that, leaving behind nothing but a trail of bodies and fear. Now, after all these years, Harris felt it again, that same cold dread. The killings had started once again. Mark, you're not going to believe this, Officer Daniels said, stepping into the hallway. His voice was lower than usual, like he didn't want to disturb something sacred or something dangerous. Harris didn't respond immediately, just nodded and pushed through the door into Sarah Green's bedroom. The air hit him like a wall, stale, thick, and rotten, the kind of air that sticks to your skin, but it wasn't the smell that made his stomach churn. Jesus Christ, Harris whispered, eyes locked onto the scene before him. Sarah's body lay crumpled on the floor, limbs bent at impossible angles. Her skin was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. But that wasn't what caught Harris's attention. Her mouth, ripped into a grotesque smile, had been carved wide open, so deep that the skin around her lips had begun to tear. It was as if someone had taken joy in destroying her face. Daniel stood beside him, fidgeting, his voice tight. Same as before, right? That smile. Harris said nothing. He couldn't. His gaze drifted up to the wall where the words were scrawled in crimson, dripping down the plaster. Go to sleep. It was like stepping back in time, back to Emily's room, back to that night. Fuck, Harris muttered, barely able to keep his hands from shaking. He's back. Daniels shifted nervously. But why her? She's just a kid. What the hell did she ever do to deserve this? Harris stared at Sarah's body, then at the blood-soaked wall. He didn't need a reason, he said, his voice flat, not one that makes sense. Yeah, but... Daniels hesitated. It feels different this time, doesn't it? Like he's making it personal. Harris finished, mind already racing as it traced through the possibilities. His fingers twitched as he lifted Sarah's blood-soaked hair away from her face. The cuts on her cheeks sharp, almost surgical. Deliberate, too precise for someone in a frenzy. This isn't just about killing, Harris said quietly, almost to himself. This is a message. Daniels furrowed his brow. What kind of message? Harris straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. One for me. Mark, Daniels' voice wavered. You think he's doing this for you? Harris's jaw tightened. I know it. Daniel stood there, lost for words, until he finally managed. Why now? It's been what, 10 years? Doesn't matter, Harris said, staring at the message again. Time doesn't mean shit to a monster like Jeff. He was always playing the long game. Daniels looked uneasy. So, what now? We find out why he chose her. Harris's eyes flickered down to Sarah's face one last time. And we find him before he chooses someone else. The drive back to his apartment was quiet, too quiet. Harris's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white, the image of Sarah Green's body flashing in his mind over and over again. The grin, the cuts, the blood. It was all too familiar. too personal. He parked outside his building but didn't get out. Instead, he stared at the dashboard, his mind lost in memories he'd buried long ago. His sister Emily, her face locked in that same cruel smile, floated to the surface. Harris's phone buzzed, and a sharp, sudden jolt pulled him back to reality. He glanced down at the screen. Blocked number. He knew it wasn't a telemarketer. His gut told him to answer, but his fingers froze just before they hit the screen. Not yet. Not now. With a frustrated sigh, he stepped out of the car and into the night, the cool air doing little to soothe the unease creeping up his spine. He walked into his apartment, flicking on the lights and heading straight to the kitchen. Harris didn't bother with the whiskey tonight. There was no numbing the feeling. Files were spread across the kitchen table, open and scattered in a chaotic mess. Pictures of Emily, crime scene reports, even the old newspaper clippings from when Jeff the killer had first appeared. His sister's smiling face stared up at him from one of the photos, so different from how he remembered her in the end. Harris sat down, staring at the mess before him. "Why now, Jeff?" he muttered to himself. "Why the hell now?" His phone buzzed again. Blocked number. Harris grabbed the phone, staring at it for a few seconds longer than he should have. Finally, he answered. "Who is this?" There was silence on the other end, then a voice, low and raspy. "Mark, it's been a while." Harris's blood turned to ice. That voice, it was unmistakable. Jeff. A dark chuckle echoed through the receiver, slow and deliberate. "Miss me?" Harris's jaw clenched. "Where the fuck are you?" "Closer than you think." The line went dead. For a moment, Harris just stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear. His mind raced in sync with his pulse. This wasn't a random return. Jeff the killer was back for a reason. The garage was suffocating. The scent of gasoline mingled with something far worse: blood, decay, and violence. Harris ducked under the police tape, his footsteps heavy as he approached the dangling body of Tom Hargrove. The man hung from the rafters like a puppet, his arms and legs twisted into impossible shapes, his face carved into the same smile that hunted Harris. "Fuck me," Daniels whispered behind him. "It's him, isn't it?" Harris didn't answer. His eyes locked on the blood pooling beneath Hargrove's feet. The words scrawled across the floor in deep red were unmistakable. "Did you miss me?" "Yeah," Harris finally answered in a low voice. "It's him." He crouched down, examining the letters more closely. They were uneven, almost rushed, as if Jeff had been in a hurry this time. That was unusual. Jeff had always enjoyed taking his time. "You notice something off?" Harris asked, looking over at Daniels. Daniels looked confused. "Off? Besides the guy hanging like a fucking marionette?" "These cuts." Harris pointed to the jagged edges on Hargrove's face. "They're messy. Jeff's kills weren't messy. He was methodical." Harris stood, his hands on his hips as he scanned the scene. "It means he's in a hurry. It means he's after something or someone specific." Daniels shifted. "You think this is all leading somewhere, don't you?" "You'd be a fool not to." Harris's voice was firm. He didn't want to say it out loud, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. Tom Hargrove wasn't just another random kill. He'd worked at the garage where Harris's father had taken their car when they were kids. Harris had been there, Emily had been there. He knew Sarah Green and Tom Hargrove wouldn't be the last. Harris sat in his office, the dim light casting long shadows across the room as he stared at the mess of case files strewn about his desk. His fingers trembled as he flipped through the photographs, police reports, and witness statements. Each piece felt like a fragment of something much bigger, something he hadn't fully grasped yet. But the shape of it was starting to form, and it was ugly. He rubbed his face, exhaustion creeping in. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but the connections emerging were undeniable. Sarah Green, Tom Hargrove. Neither of them were just victims plucked out of random chance. They were tied to his life, his past. To Emily. Jeff wasn't just killing for the thrill. He was drawing Harris in, targeting those who had touched his life in some way. Harris's mind kept circling back to Sarah's name, Green. Her aunt had been in Emily's class. He hadn't thought much of it at first. It seemed like a small, almost coincidental detail. But now it gnawed at him. Why would Jeff target Sarah? Why start with her? He jumped as his phone buzzed. Blocked number. Harris glared at it, pulse pounding. It was Jeff. He knew it was the bastard. The calls had been coming in at random hours for the last few days. Every time, Harris hesitated to pick it up. Not this time. Snatching up the phone, he answered and said, "What the fuck do you want?" Rage burned inside Harris. For a moment, there was nothing but silence from the other end, followed by a soft, familiar chuckle. "You know, Mark, you were always too slow. Too slow to save her, too slow to stop me." Harris's grip tightened around the phone, knuckles white. "Be a man, Jeff. Tell me where you are, you bastard." Another laugh, this one darker. "I'm right where I need to be." The line went dead. Harris slammed the phone down on the desk, white-hot anger bubbling just below the surface. Jeff was playing with him, taunting him, and now it was becoming clear. These murders weren't just about the victims, they were about Harris, about making him suffer all over again. But why now? Why come back after all these years? Harris flipped open Tom Hargrove's file, his eyes scanning the familiar details. Tom had been a mechanic, someone Harris's family had known for years. Harris's father used to take the car to his shop when they were kids. Emily had been there with him once or twice, watching as Tom and his dad chatted about repairs. His stomach twisted. He thought those nightmares were buried deep, forgotten, but now Jeff was pulling them out, turning them into weapons. The phone buzzed again, Harris blocking out the incessant vibrating until it stopped. He had to think, to piece together the fragments before Jeff could pull the rug out from under him again. Tom wasn't just another name on Jeff's list. He was part of Harris's life, just like Sarah. Realization slammed into Harris like a train. Jeff wasn't just killing indiscriminately. He was recreating the worst moments of Harris's life, one body at a time, and he knew it wasn't over yet. The room was a horror show. Jessica's body had been torn apart, her intestines pulled from her stomach and strewn across the living room floor like decorations. Her fingers had been broken backward, the nails cracked and bloody from clawing at the walls in a desperate attempt to escape. Her mouth, like the others, was carved into that horrible smile, stretching so wide it looked like her face would split in two. Blood soaked the carpet, splattered across the furniture in dark arterial sprays. The message, "Go to sleep, scrawled on the wall above her head in thick, wet letters, almost as though the killer had written it slowly, enjoying every second. "Jesus," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible as they surveyed the scene. Harris stood at the center of the room, eyes locked on Jessica's mutilated body, heart slamming in his chest. He took a step closer, his boots squelching in the soaked carpet. Every bit of him screamed at him to walk away, to turn his back on this nightmare. But he couldn't. His eyes flicked over the body, scanning for details, clues that might tell him why Jeff had chosen her. Then it clicked. Jessica's father had been the contractor hired to renovate Harris's childhood home after Emily's murder. Another connection, another victim tied to his past. "This isn't random," Harris said under his breath. "What?" Daniels turned, brow furrowed. "All of them. Sarah Green, Tom Hargrove, and now Jessica Miller." Harris's voice was low, but the conviction was unmistakable. "They're not random victims. They're all connected to me, to Emily." Daniels blinked, trying to process what Harris was saying. You think this is about you?" "I know it is," Harris said, his voice tight. He ran a hand through his hair, mind racing. "Jeff is dragging me back into this piece by piece. He's tearing apart my past, killing everyone who is connected to it." "Jesus, Mark." Daniels took a step back, his face pale. "But why now, after all these years?" "I don't know," Harris admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "But I'm gonna find out." Harris sat in his car outside the crime scene, the rain tapping softly against the windshield. His hands gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, the weight of the situation finally settling in. Jeff wasn't killing only for the thrill. Every victim was carefully chosen, all connected to his past. The next victim wouldn't just be another person from his past. The next victim would be much closer. His phone buzzed, the glow from the screen cutting through the darkness. Blocked number. With trembling hands, Harris answered the call. "You're finally paying attention." Jeff's voice rasped through the phone, low and menacing. Harris simmered for what felt like eternity, the suppressed rage boiling away the thin thread of patience and will he had remaining. His face grew hot. "Where are you, goddammit?" Flecks of spit flew from Harris's mouth as he lost all control, slamming a clenched fist hard enough against the driver's side window that it shattered around his arm. Searing pain flooded through his arm, only fueling the absolute hate for the monster softly chuckling into his ear. "You fucking coward! If you want me so bad, come get me. I'm still at the crime scene of the last poor girl you fucking ripped apart. Come on!" No answer. Only the soft patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder filled the silence that seemed to stretch forever. Then, a soft chuckle. "Oh, Mark, where's the thrill in that?" Jeff said wryly. "This was just the prelude. I hope you're ready for the main performance." The line clicked. Only the soft patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder left to fill Harris's storming thoughts. The rain pelted against Harris's windshield, blurring the street lights into smeared halos. His hand, still bleeding from smashing the window earlier, gripped the steering wheel tightly. Every breath was shallow, every thought clouded with images of blood and death. Jessica's mutilated body haunted him, But that wasn't the worst part. It was the growing certainty that Jeff was targeting those closest to Emily, and by extension, him. The buzzing of his phone tore him out of his trance. His eyes darted toward the screen. Another call. Daniels, Harris muttered, picking up the phone with a sigh. Mark? Daniel's voice came through, shaky, unsteady. It's another body. Harris straightened, the tension in his chest tightening like a vice. Where? Parking garage, downtown, corner of 7th and Hill. I'll meet you there. The line clicked dead before Harris could respond. He clenched his jaw, throwing the car into drive and tearing through the rain-soaked streets. The thought of another body made his blood run cold. How many more? How many more people were tied to his past? Harris pulled up to the parking garage, its concrete structure looming against the darkened sky. Red and blue lights from police cruisers illuminated the scene as officers stood by the perimeter, cordoning off the area. The rain had let up slightly, but the air was thick with the stench of wet pavement and something else. The sight of John Michael's body made Harris's stomach churn. He was sprawled out in the middle of the second floor, limbs twisted and pinned to the concrete with spikes, in a grotesque display. Jeff's signature smile carved into his face. The cuts were jagged, uneven, and blood still pooled around him, the smell pungent and metallic. Laying next to the man's mutilated face was his badge, along with Jeff's taunt stained in red. Dance while the music still plays. Harris froze for a moment, his mind racing. John, the first officer on the scene the night Emily died. He remembered the young cop standing on the doorstep of his childhood home, pale as a ghost, trying to keep the blood from staining his uniform. He's one of them, isn't he? Daniel's voice pulled Harris from his thoughts. Harris nodded, his throat dry. John was there the night Emily died, first officer on the scene. Daniels cursed under his breath, running a hand through his wet hair. Jesus, Mark, you think? I know. Harris interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the blood-stained floor. This isn't random. Jeff's targeting people connected to Emily. Daniels looked at him wide-eyed. Why now? It's been over a decade. Harris had no answer. He simply stared at John's mutilated face, the realization that Jeff was dragging him back into the past sinking deeper and deeper. Back at the office, Harris sat hunched over his desk, a mess of files and crime scene photos scattered in front of him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he still didn't have the full picture. Jessica Miller, her father, the contractor who renovated their home after Emily's murder. Tom Hargrove, the mechanic who had seen the confrontation between Harris and Jeff the day Emily rejected him. And now John Michaels, the first officer at the scene. But then there was Sarah Green. What was her connection? His mind drifted back to Sarah's Aunt Lisa, who had been Emily's best friend. She was there at the birthday party, the day Jeff's obsession had begun. That day marked the moment everything spiraled out of control. Emily's rejection, Harris's confrontation with Jeff, and now Jeff was systematically erasing everyone who had been part of that day or Emily's murder. The phone buzzed, jarring him out of his thoughts. It was Daniels. We got him, Mark. Daniels said, his voice tense and hurried. We got Jeff. He's at the station. Harris froze, his heart skipping a beat. What? He's at the station. We got him. Something about Daniel's voice didn't sit right. There was something off, but Harris was too focused, too desperate for it to be over. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket and bolted out of the office, speeding toward the station. The police station was dead silent when Harris arrived. The lights flickered in the dim hallway, casting long shadows against the walls. Something was wrong. His gut twisted as he moved further into the station, his boots echoing off the tile floors. The smell hit him first. His stomach lurched as he rounded the corner. Bodies, blood everywhere. Officers were strewn across the floor, their limbs torn from their bodies, their faces unrecognizable beneath the gore. Blood splattered the walls, and the metallic scent filled Harris's lungs, choking him. And then he saw him. Daniels, barely alive, slumped against the wall, his face peeled off and pinned above him like some kind of grotesque mask. His badge was nailed to the wall next to it, gleaming under the flickering light. Harris rushed to his side, dropping to his knees in the blood-soaked hallway. Daniels, what the fuck happened? Daniels' breaths were shallow, wet with blood. He struggled to speak, his voice barely a whisper. He made me call you. Harris's heart pounded in his chest. Where is he? You know. Where? Daniel rasped, blood bubbling at his lips. He's waiting for you. Daniel's body went limp, his final breath escaping him as the light in his eyes faded. Harris stood there, staring at the blood-soaked message scrawled above Daniel's. You know where the final act is. Harris sped through the streets, his heart racing as he drove toward his childhood home. The pieces had all fallen into place. Jessica, Tom, John, Sarah, they were all connected to that day, Emily's birthday party, the day Jeff's obsession had begun, the day Harris had confronted him, shoving him to the ground and telling him to stay away from Emily. That was the day Jeff decided to destroy Harris's life. His phone buzzed again. Harris grabbed it without thinking, expecting another taunt from Jeff. But instead, he heard a small, broken voice. Help, please, help me. Daniel's daughter. Harris's blood ran cold. In the background, he could hear Jeff's quiet voice, almost a whisper. It's almost time, Mark. Don't keep me waiting. The house stood in darkness as Harris approached. His heart pounded in his chest, every step heavy with dread. The front door was slightly ajar, and inside, the haunting melody of Emily's music box drifted through the air, echoing through the house like a ghost. The house was almost exactly how he remembered it, but something felt wrong. Shadows danced in the corners, twisting and warping as Harris stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of rain and something darker. As Harris moved through the house, memories flooded back to him. Emily's laughter, her smile, and then the blood. So much blood. He reached the basement door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The music box's melody grew louder. As he descended the stairs, the soft clicks of its winding mechanism echoing in the silence. And then Harris felt it. His foot pressed down on something sharp. A trap. Before he could react, a spike shot out from the wall, tearing into his side. The pain was blinding, white hot, and he collapsed to one knee, gasping as blood poured from the wound. He pressed a hand to his side, trying in vain to stem the flow of blood. And then Jeff was there, a blur of movement, a flash of steel. Harris barely had time to react before Jeff was on him, slashing at him with a knife, each cut deep and precise. Harris stumbled back, his right arm rendered almost useless as Jeff's blade tore through muscle. "You've always been too slow, Mark," Jeff hissed, his smile gleaming in the dim light. "Too slow to save her. Too slow to stop me." Harris's vision blurred from the pain, but he could still make out Jeff's face. His smile wide and twisted, his eyes gleaming with madness. Harris tried to fire his gun, but his right arm dangled useless. The pain was overwhelming, but he couldn't stop. Not when he was so close. Not now. The basement was a nightmare. Kimberly, Daniel's wife, was strapped to a contraption, her mouth slowly being cranked open by a series of jagged metal spikes. Madison, Daniel's daughter, was tied to a chair, a birthday hat perched atop her head, a sick echo of Emily's birthday party. And there, standing behind Madison, grinned Jeff, slowly winding the music box Harris had given Emily for her last birthday. "It's time to make a choice, Mark," he taunted. "Her or her?" Kimberly's screams filled the basement. As the contraption tore into her jaw, the sound of bone cracking and flesh tearing echoing through the room. Harris's mind raced, the pain in his side nearly blinding him, but he knew he had to act. He struggled to lift his gun, but his arm was barely responding, numb from the deep slashes Jeff had inflicted. His eyes darted between Kimberly, her eyes wide with terror as the spikes inched deeper, and Madison, shaking uncontrollably in the chair, her face pale beneath the crooked birthday hat. Jeff's grin widened, his eyes gleaming in the faint moonlight creeping through the basement window. "Tick-tock, Mark," he whispered, his voice low and chilling. He wound the music box again, the delicate notes punctuating the grotesque scene like a ticking time bomb. Harris gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain. He had no time left. If he tried to shoot Jeff, he knew his aim would be off, and the bastard would make his move before he could even get a second shot. Inch by inch, he edged closer to Madison. His mind raced. How could he save them both? But Jeff had orchestrated this moment too well, left him with no options. The soft notes emanating from Emily's music box seemed to mock him. The contraption around Kimberly's head clicked again, pulling her mouth wider. She screamed in agony, the sound barely human as her jaw began to split. "Tick-tock, Mark," Jeff whispered again. Harris's heart hammered in his chest. Madison, the terrified girl, looked at him, pleading silently with her wide, tear-filled eyes. His instincts screamed at him to protect her, to stop Jeff, but that meant making the impossible choice. Jeff stood behind Madison, his knife flashing in the dim light. He taunted Harris with a grin, his fingers tracing the girl's shoulder. "Last chance, detective. Save her or her." Harris's vision blurred from the agony searing through his side, but he didn't hesitate anymore. There was no saving them both. His fingers tightened on the revolver. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words catching in his throat as he aimed the gun at Kimberly's suffering body. Before the spike could drive fully through her skull, he pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the room and Kimberly went limp, the unbearable sounds of her pain finally silenced. A second of eerie stillness filled the basement. Jeff's wicked laugh followed, low and rumbling, as if the whole thing had been one elaborate joke. Harris's stomach twisted with disgust and rage. He had fallen right into Jeff's trap. But as Jeff took a step toward him, Harris used that moment of distraction. With a grunt of sheer determination, Harris shoved Madison to the floor, knocking the chair sideways. Jeff moved fast, but Harris was faster. He pressed the barrel of his gun against Jeff's chest and fired point blank. The impact sent Jeff stumbling back, his smile faltering for a moment. But the monster recovered quickly, his knife flashing toward Harris in a flurry of strikes. Pain exploded across Harris's right side as Jeff slashed him again and again, deep, rapid cuts leaving Harris reeling. His gun clicked empty. Harris dropped to his knees, the world spinning around him. Blood poured from his wounds, his body trembling as he fought to remain conscious. Jeff's face loomed over him, his twisted grin the last thing Harris saw before everything went black. He woke to the sound of Madison screaming. His vision swam as he blinked through the haze of pain, struggling to push himself up. The music box was still playing, its haunting melody filling the room. Jeff was gone. His knife left embedded deep in Harris's side, and the blood from his wounds felt warm as if soaked through his shirt. Every muscle screamed in agony, but he forced himself to move. Madison was thrashing in her chair, her terrified sobs filling the basement. Harris staggered over, each step a struggle, as the pain in his side threatened to take him down. His hands trembled as he pulled the knife from his flesh with a sickening squelch, using it to slice through the ropes binding Madison to the chair. The girl collapsed into his arms, her small body trembling against him as she clung to him with desperate strength. Harris barely had the strength to hold her, but he did, shielding her from the horrific scene around them. "It's okay. It's over," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. Madison didn't respond, her sobs the only sound that echoed through the darkened room. Together, they stumbled toward the stairs, Harris's legs barely able to support their combined weight. His entire body was shaking with the effort, but he had to get them out. He couldn't let Jeff finish what he'd started. The music box's haunting melody followed them up the stairs, growing fainter the closer they got to the door. Harris kicked the basement door open, the cold night air rushing in and offering a small respite from the suffocating dread that filled the house. They made it to the front porch, Harris collapsing onto the wooden steps with Madison still clutching him. His hand fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with blood as he dialed 911. He could barely focus on the words as he gave the address. His childhood home, a place where the nightmare had started all those years ago. Harris watched the lights of the approaching police cars in the distance, the wailing sirens growing louder. Relief should have come, but all he felt was a cold emptiness. This wasn't over. He knew it, and deep down, he knew Jeff wasn't gone. As the first flashing lights became visible, Harris heard a familiar sound. The soft, eerie melody of Emily's music box, still playing from inside the house. His blood ran cold as he looked back at the door, the chilling sound creeping through the air like a final, taunting reminder. Then his phone buzzed in his hand. Harris glanced down at the screen, his heart skipping a beat. The caller ID read Daniels.